showing where we are here in Idaho. That's right, sightseers, we've driven all the way up Interstate 15 and have made it into the Gem State. And you can see right here on the map that we're just outside of Soda Springs, our destination for the day. But before we head over into Soda Springs, we decided to stop off here because not only were we intrigued by the sign that said Sheep Rock Interpretive Site, but this particular spot happens to be one of the old landmarks that was used to guide pioneers along the Oregon Trail. That's right, towering some 1,200 feet above Bear River is Sheep Rock. And this rock was used as an important landmark for those traveling west. How do we know this? Because it was described in many emigrant journals and diaries. Nowadays, this landscape feature is known as Soda Point, but to anyone who traveled along the old Oregon Trail, it'll always be Sheep Rock. By the way, for those of you wondering, as the name suggests, at one time, bighorn sheep made that rock their home. Well, this is cool. I find it amazing that we're now exploring an area that was part of the Oregon Trail. I don't know about you, but back when I was a kid, the Oregon Trail was something that invoked a sense of mystery and wonder. We even had in school, this was actually my first exposure to a video game.
What?
When I was in 5th or 6th grade, I think it was probably 6th grade, our classroom got its first computer. I know. Nowadays, it's just assumed that everybody's got a computer in school, but not then. Then we had one computer that was shared by all the students, and interestingly enough, the one thing about that computer was it had a game on there called the Oregon Trail. Obviously, it was meant to be educational, but it was a fun game. It was relatively simple. Basically, what you did was get prompted by a series of questions, and then depending on your answer to the questions would depend on what would happen to you in the game. So if you were all of a sudden accosted by a band of outlaws, it would ask you some questions and you'd answer them, and then that would give you the result as to whether or not you fought off the outlaws, or maybe you ended up starving or whatever.
Actually, at home I have the game.
Yeah, isn't yours a handheld though?
Yeah, it's a handheld. I bought it a few years ago. Still haven't solved it, but keep dying before I get to the end. Still kind of fun to play.
I believe it was meant to help you develop problem-solving skills. Now, if we look over here, we can see that they have a map of the Oregon Trail. It started over in Independence, Missouri, which meant you would have had to make it at least to Independence, Missouri from wherever else you were, east, north, or south of there, if you wanted to make it onto the Oregon Trail. And then you followed it along through Kansas, Nebraska, Wyoming, over here in Idaho, which is in the area we're at now, and all the way up into Oregon, 1,150 miles worth of harsh conditions that I'm pretty sure that many of us have never even come close to experiencing. A few other things to point out before we move on. They have this placard here that talks about the value of a shortcut. There were people that came out for the gold rush, especially, who wanted to make sure that they could get to where they were going really quick because they didn't want to miss out on their opportunity to strike it rich with gold. Thus, they looked for shortcuts along the way. One of them being John Bidwell, who in 1841 set out with a party of 69 Pacific Coast pioneers. Apparently, when they reached this point in August of 1841, half his group decided to go to north to the along the Oregon Trail, but the rest of the group decided to take this alternate route, which was a bad decision. I don't know what happened to the group. The placard doesn't say. All it says is that the California crew turned south down the Bear River to try a terrible route west of Salt Lake. And then apparently this other pioneer, Joseph R. Childs, decided to return east in 1842 to try and find a more practical route to California. The other thing of major interest up here is this Oregon Trail Memorial that was erected in 1931 by one Mrs. Allura F.H. Beardsley. Mrs. Beardsley lost her uncle, William Henry Harrison of Massachusetts, to the Oregon Trail sometime about 1850. And then if we go to the other side, we can see that there is also mention of the fact that 1 mile southwest near the river Precipice is a monument of the site where a massacre happened of 16 men, women, and children. This was in 1860. A few short years later, in 1863, another massacre occurred on this very same river, the Bear River, except it was of the Native Americans. At the crack of dawn on January 29, 1863, the single largest massacre of Native Americans by U.S. troops west of the Mississippi began. Nearly 450 Shoshone men, women, and children were camped along the river that day, and out of them, about 380 perished. That battle ended up being one of the worst disasters for Native Americans in the West. We decided to stop here because apparently you can see old ruts, swales, and traces of the old wagon train that used to ride through here. Correction, wagon trains, because there were more than one wagon train that rode through this area. And if you know what you're looking for, you'll be able to spot them easily out there. Unfortunately, I'm looking and I don't see it. But who am I to argue with the Caribou Historical Society, the National Park Service, and the U.S. Department of the Interior? If they say they're here, they must be here somewhere. The sign over here says no motorized vehicles beyond this point. It does not say, however, that I can't walk out there. The ground, however, argues differently. It feels rather soft. And instead of me leaving tracks over the emigrant tracks, I think I'll just stay put and take their word for it. Well, let's move on. We still have Soda Springs to explore. And from what I hear, there's quite a bit of interesting artifacts and things, historical things there that we definitely don't want to miss out. Well, wait a minute now. I just spotted a sign, a marker for the California Trail and the Oregon Trail. And if you look right through there, you can see where the trail went. And if I'm not mistaken, if you look closely, you can almost see where the wagon wheel tracks were. Kind of. Or maybe it's just that I want to believe. Next up, checking out where the Camp Connor Complex is. And what exactly is the Camp Connor Complex? Your guess is as good as mine, but we're going to find out here in just a moment. From reading this placard here, I was able to determine that Camp Connor was actually a military fort established by Colonel Patrick E. Connor. The thing to remember, sightseers, is back when the pioneers were traveling along the Oregon Trail, traveling the California Trail out for the gold rush, is that there wasn't any active military presence this far west. We were essentially trespassing on Native American lands. Thus, some of the Native American tribes were quite hostile to the presence of these people just tramping on through. Especially since some of the people were just basically stealing their land, setting up, homesteads and whatnot wherever they wanted to. Not to mention, there was also the problem of thieves, murderers, the old Western gangsters that were roaming this countryside waiting to prey on unsuspecting pioneers. Thus, After plenty of outcries from the people, plus newspaper articles that were writing these scathing reports of what was happening out in the West, the Army sent Colonel Connor out here along with 300 soldiers. Apparently they established a camp here. They believe it might have been somewhere in this vicinity, although because there's nothing left remaining of it, they don't know exactly for sure. Interestingly enough, Colonel Connor is also responsible for launching that surprise attack on the unsuspecting Shoshone along the Bear River, resulting in that massacre that we heard about over at Sheep Rock. Apparently after that, in October of 1863, U.S. officials and leaders of the Shoshone and Bannock, which represented about 5,000 Native Americans, signed the Camp Connor Treaty, putting an end officially to the violence in the area. As we know from our travels down in California, the Shoshone have ended up in a very small area. That's where they have their reservation now. Obviously, signing that treaty had a major impact on their lives. With a name like Soda Springs, you'd expect there to be at least one, if not several springs. There are, which we'll get to momentarily. But first, I want to introduce you to something that you won't find anywhere else in the world, and that is the only captive geyser out there. The story of how this city captured a geyser is rather interesting. Back in 1937, Soda Springs city fathers were intent on locating hot water for a community swimming pool. Unwittingly, they drilled into this mound that you see in front of us and unleashed a geyser that shot up 100 feet into the air. Nowadays, they have the geyser capped with a timer system allowing the geyser to erupt every hour on the hour. It's 4 o'clock, should be erupting any minute now. They have it set to run about 10-12 minutes, which means if you don't get here in time to see it initially blow, you can still catch it in action for a few minutes after. When you're done looking at the geyser, you can come over here and check out Soda Springs Ground Observer Corps Skywatch post. This post was in play between the years of 1956 and 1959. And what exactly is a ground observer post? Well, back in the 1950s, this would have been after the Korean War, we had, or not we, our government had the idea that we were vulnerable to air attacks. Essentially, they thought Russia was going to attack us from the air. As a result, they set about recruiting volunteers to watch the skies. And as it just so happens, Soda Springs, Idaho was the location of one of these observer posts. We're now over at Hooper Spring, one of 2 spots in town where I know of that you can actually drink the soda water that comes up out of the earth. Soda water? That's right, the water here is naturally carbonated and it bubbles up out of these springs and you can drink it. Or so I heard. Indeed, you can drink it. Soda water from these springs was marketed back in the 1880s. People drank the water out of this very spring. This is what the spring looked like before they beautified it through the Works Progress Administration. Well, I got my cup here. We're going to try some of this water and see how good it is. I've heard that it is very hard water, meaning it has a high iron content. Some people don't care for it. Me, having grown up in Wisconsin and being exposed to well water, don't particularly mind it, but it's not exactly my favorite either. See, it's bubbling a little bit. Yep, definitely has an iron smell to it. Fizzy. Definitely fizzy. I think I could get used to drinking this. I have been drinking a lot more sparkling water these days. Flavored sparkling water. I guess the locals tend to flavor this with like lemon, make like a lemonade version of it. Well, there's some other sights to see in the park. Why don't we go check those out? You can see that the waters from the creek bed are flowing fairly fast. That's because the snow's melting off the mountains, causing the rivers and creeks to flood. You can definitely hear the sounds of spring in the air. You've got the sound of frogs in the background, birds chirping and singing. And then if we look up over here, you can see what the primary economic base is for this area. You might be wondering, what am I talking about? Like everywhere, you need to have some sort of economic driver. Well, here it happens to be mining, but not probably the type of mining you're accustomed to. This type of mining happens to be for phosphate, the same substance that can be found in chemical lawn fertilizers that so many people put on their grass in spring to make it grow nice and green. As you can see, we have now arrived at another spring. This one is known as Octagon Spring, and it's one of more than 100 mineral springs that early visitors found in the area. This one you can also drink from. I thought we'd sample it as well. And here we are. How about that? This one just bubbles up from a little spot here. You can see it's really super fizzy, a lot more fizzy compared to the other spring we were at, Hooper Spring. I'm excited to try it. I wonder if it'll taste the same or if it'll have a slightly different flavor. Well, it doesn't look as fizzy in my cup as it does in the spring. As for the sniff test, it doesn't smell nearly as full of iron as the other spring. Ooh. This is fizzier than the other spring. You wouldn't know by looking at it, but it definitely feels more fizzy in the mouth. Well, I better grab my cap, my cover for the old Misfit mug. Don't want to leave that behind. Ooh. And make sure I don't slip down into the old spring, into the Octagon Spring. I think it's pretty safe to say that by now you all have a good understanding as to how the town got its name. Speaking of the town, we should really head over into the downtown so you can see some of the historic buildings that are still standing. We're now at the corner of 1st and Main, and if you look over here, off in the distance, you can see their captive geyser, or where their captive geyser is, that I showed you earlier in the video. And then down this little alleyway where you see the do not enter signs, off in the distance there, you'll find the shack, or that little observation building that they used back in the 1950s. And then over here, looking down Main Street, you'll see the Enders Building. On the National Register of Historic Places, the Enders Building is currently serving as a hotel, museum, and gift shop. Built in 1919, the original Enders Hotel had a mall on the 1st and 2nd floors that contained a variety of stores and services, a ballroom, and a restaurant, with the actual hotel rooms being located on the 3rd floor. Later, during the 1930s, the ballroom was remodeled into apartments for tenants. Though said to be haunted by spirits, the newly restored Enders Hotel of today is undoubtedly a historic building filled with fascinating relics from the town's past. Then across the street you'll find the City Transfer and Storage Building, where Tilly's Chop Shop is located, the Main Street Diner, and the Idaho Theater, where you can still catch a movie Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. It looks like they're currently showing the movie Escape from Germany. That's one I haven't seen yet. And yes, I'm wearing a different hat now. The weather's taken a bit of a turn, put a little bit of a damper on things, and the old noggin needs to be kept warm. This is about 30 degrees colder than it was earlier. Moving on, we can see that on the side of this building here is a day and night deposit, leading me to believe that at one time this may have been a bank building. And then over here on the corner is Shimmicks. We had a Shimmicks back where I come from, my home area. Don't know if it's the same, like if this was a brand that was, you know, nationwide, or if it just so happens to be that they have the same name. Anyways, thought I'd show you just so you can see what's in this area of the downtown. The most historical building being the Enders Building, probably the biggest point of interest here. I do know that the Senior Citizen Center down there was built in the early 1900s. It served as the Gorton Supply Store for quite a few years, for about 34 years. And at one time, it was the second oldest business in Soda Springs. Now, as you can see, it's had a facelift and serves as the Caribou County Senior Citizen Center. And it looks like it has a thrift store inside. Too bad it's not open today. I know Marty would love to explore that. Walking down First Street a little bit, we can see that they have a Caribou Lodge, number 84, a Goldenrod chapter, number 64, and a Job's Daughters, Bethel, number 60, that all seem to meet in this building here. And then, continuing on, if we look across the street, we can see where the fire department is and where McDonald's, not home of the Big Mac, but McDonald's as in a leather and accessories place made to fit, custom made to fit your Harley-Davidson motorcycle. The next door to what used to be McDonald's are these old brick buildings. This first one appears to have been an old beauty parlor, because if we look at the sign, it says hair design, men and women's hairstyling. All because two people fell in love. Aww, isn't that special? But kind of an odd place for that sign, don't you think? Oh, and then there's this lonely little blue chair just sitting here, waiting for somebody to come along and sit on it. And then we've got Babe's Dirtwork over here in the old service department building. Obviously, the service department is no longer servicing the needs of Soda Springs, but Babe's Dirtwork is. And then next door we have Hair Nation, which is obviously a haircutting salon of some sorts. And then we've got this Celebrating Caribou County sign that says, the Morrisites built the first town in Greater Soda Springs, arriving in May of 1863 under the protection of Colonel Patrick Connor. Colonel Connor, if you recall from earlier, was the one that set up that military camp that's over on the other side of town, and also was involved in that massacre of the Native Americans. Besides the mining that goes on, there must be a lot of farming, because if you look over there, you can see a granary or grain elevator, and then down over here way at the end of the street, you can see another larger structure that also must be some sort of grain elevator. Now here's a place that's right up Morty's alley.
Coors? I used to hoist quite a few of them back in the day. But did you know it was illegal in most states? Why? Because Coors didn't pasteurize their beer.
Really? I had no idea.
Allegedly. You don't believe me? Look it up to see if it's true.
Another place in town that's on the National Register of Historic Places is the First Presbyterian Church. Also known as the Rock Church, this church was built in the late 1800s out of rock that was slated to be used for a roundhouse by the Union Pacific Railroad. When plans changed, Union Pacific donated it for the building of the church. That is, by the way, the original church bell from 1897. The other thing that you'll find here in Soda Springs that you probably won't find anywhere else is the dinky. The dinky is a little engine, a miniature locomotive that played an integral part in the history of Caribou County. This little locomotive was used to haul supplies in the building of the Alexander Reservoir Dam in 1924. Upon the dam's completion, the locomotive was abandoned. Later, in 1976, when the reservoir was drained for repairs, the locomotive was recovered. And thanks to the Union Pacific Railroad, who restored it, it now sits here in Soda Springs. Now, if I'm not mistaken, this building here, which is now known as the Scout House, used to be the Soda Springs City Hall. On the National Register of Historic Places, this was built in 1902 and was originally used as the town hall with the police station and jail in the basement. One of the things that makes this building so unique is the fact that it's constructed out of random pieces of lava rock. Even its foundation is made out of lava rock, and I guess it's only one of a few remaining examples of its kind. The other thing that I found interesting is that the police station used this as its location as recently as 2001. Another building that you can find here in Soda Springs that is on the National Register of Historic Places is their courthouse. Built in 1919 by C.K. Bacher, the design is a monumental, formally symmetrical, neoclassical style. Say what? Okay, busted. I had a little cheat note to help me with that. Moving on. Across the street from the courthouse, you'll find this block of buildings and a mural painted on the side of the Sanders Furniture Building. Next up, the Tally-Ho Coach House. Inside this building, you'll find an old Yellowstone Park transportation coach that was supposedly used to transport President Theodore Roosevelt along with naturalists John Muir and John Burroughs on a tour of Yellowstone in 1903. How cool is that this is here in Soda Springs? Well, moving on, there's one more thing I want to show you that's a part of this part of the park, and that is this strange looking contraption over here. It's known as the Conda Bus, aka the Galloping Goose. This bus traveled between Conda, a company-started mining town, and Soda Springs. The company provided it actually as free transportation for the miners because it was more reliable than trying to get there by car in winter. In case you didn't notice the details, this bus actually traveled on the rails. So pretty cool that the company provided that as free transportation for its workers. Another thing that's interesting about Soda Springs is, much like Boulder City, Nevada, where you can find old-style motels and hotels, you'll also find those here, like the Caribou Lodge and RV Park, established in 1949, or the JR Inn. There even used to be a drive-in movie theater here, where you could watch movies on the big screen. Our final stop is the Fairview Cemetery, where you'll find the wagon box grave. Not far from here, in 1861, tragedy took the lives of an entire immigrant family. 3 trappers discovered their remains. Although there were no eyewitnesses, the trappers learned that when the wagon train pulled out, the family had stayed behind to locate and retrieve their horses, which had wandered off the night before. Their bodies were placed together in their wagon box and then buried. Later, they were moved to the cemetery. And look, there it is. The headstone for the wagon box grave of 1861. The very first grave in this cemetery. It's kind of interesting where the cemetery is located. You can see the S on the side of the mountain up over there. And then if you look in this direction, you can see the big screen of the drive-in movie theater over here. And the observation booth for watching the skies is up over here. Interesting, I'm noticing a lot of woodalls buried in this cemetery. I wonder if that's any relation to... Nah, can't be. I'm actually looking for the grave of Caribou Jack. I guess he was a rather colorful character here in town. He found gold up on a mountain that's now been renamed Caribou Mountain. But his story, the story of his demise, actually is rather interesting. Apparently he was one to talk and boast, and he claimed that he was good at handling bears, grizzly bears. And I guess there was one day when he was sitting in the tavern in the local saloon drinking his fill, and some buddies of his came in and said that they had injured a bear and needed help with finishing it off. Well, of course, Caribou Jack, after having, a few too many, volunteered and said he'd go out and help him. Apparently that didn't work out so well because Caribou Jack ended up getting mauled severely by the bear, and then a few days later got blood poisoning, and well, now he's buried here in this cemetery.